Close your eyes. On March 28, 2024, in a federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan, Judge Lewis Kaplan sentenced Samuel Bankman-Fried to 25 years in prison. The sentencing followed a conviction in October 2023 on 7 counts of fraud and conspiracy. It concluded a legal reckoning that had begun 16 months earlier when the cryptocurrency exchange FTX, which Bankman-Fried had built into one of the largest in the world, collapsed over the course of 4 days in November 2022, taking with it approximately $8 billion that had belonged to FTX customers. The collapse of FTX was, in the immediate sense, a financial catastrophe, the sudden disappearance of billions of dollars belonging to customers who had trusted the exchange with their cryptocurrency. In a larger sense, it was something more. The most consequential single event in the history of the cryptocurrency industry to that point, a moment that crystallized questions about fraud, trust, and the limits of the regulatory frameworks that governed the space. FTX had been, until that week in November 2022, not a fringe actor or a suspicious operation, but one of the most legitimate-seeming, most politically connected, most media-friendly cryptocurrency companies in existence. Samuel Bankman-Fried had been the face of that legitimacy. He had testified before Congress. He had hired former regulators and Washington operatives to build a compliance and lobbying operation. He had donated substantially to political campaigns and policy organizations. He had spoken publicly about the importance of regulation, about responsible cryptocurrency industry development, about the obligations of the wealthy to do good in the world. And simultaneously, quietly, the money that FTX customers deposited on the exchange had been flowing to Alameda Research, the trading firm Bankman-Fried also controlled, to fund leveraged bets that were not the customers to make. The FTX collapse was, in a specific sense, a story about the gap between an institution's public presentation and its actual operation. A gap so large, sustained over such a long period, that the question of how it was maintained became as significant as the question of what it concealed. Bankman-Fried had not been operating a small or obscure organization. FTX had hundreds of employees, institutional investors, regulatory relationships across dozens of jurisdictions, and public visibility at the highest levels of American political and financial life. That the fundamental misappropriation of customer funds was happening at the center of that organization, undisclosed, was an extraordinary fact about the adequacy of the oversight that surrounded it. The sentencing that concluded the legal proceedings, 25 years in federal prison, announced in a Manhattan courthouse on March 28, 2024, was not the end of the FTX story. The bankruptcy proceedings continued. The regulatory debates the case had ignited continued. The questions it had raised about the oversight of cryptocurrency exchanges and the protection of retail customers continued to work their way through regulatory processes around the world. But the sentencing was the legal conclusion of Bankman-Fried's personal reckoning, and it is where this account begins. Samuel Bankman-Fried grew up in Palo Alto, California, the son of 2 Stanford law professors. He studied physics at MIT, graduated in 2014, and went to work at Jane Street Capital, a quantitative trading firm known for recruiting mathematically sophisticated people and teaching them to apply rigorous analytical methods to financial markets. He spent 3 years at Jane Street, developing the trading instincts and institutional knowledge that he would apply when he left to start his own venture. Jane Street's culture emphasized rigorous probabilistic thinking, the practice of quantifying uncertainty, making expected value calculations explicit, and evaluating decisions not by their outcomes, but by the quality of the reasoning that produced them. Bankman-Fried absorbed this framework deeply. It would shape both his approach to running Alameda and FTX, and at trial, his defense. The argument that he had made good faith business decisions based on his assessment of expected outcomes, and that the failure of those decisions did not make them fraudulent. The prosecution countered that the expected value framework had been applied selectively to the decisions he wanted to justify, and not to the decisions about disclosing FTX's true condition to its customers. In 2017, he founded Alameda Research, a quantitative cryptocurrency trading firm. The founding of Alameda coincided with the peak of the 2017 cryptocurrency bull run and its aftermath, a period when the inefficiencies in global cryptocurrency markets were significant enough that a sophisticated trading firm could capture substantial profits through arbitrage. One of the most famous of these early opportunities was the kimchi premium, the price difference between Bitcoin on Korean exchanges and Bitcoin on U.S. exchanges, which at times reached 20 to 30%. Alameda exploited this and similar inefficiencies, generating substantial profits in its early years. In 2019, Bankman-Fried founded FTX. The exchange was built to serve the sophisticated end of the cryptocurrency trading market, offering futures contracts, leveraged trading, options, and other derivative products that were popular with professional traders, but not widely available on consumer-focused exchanges. FTX was technically sophisticated, well-designed, and rapidly gained credibility with institutional traders who found it more capable than competing platforms. By 2021, it was one of the largest cryptocurrency exchanges in the world by trading volume, had attracted venture capital investment from some of the most prestigious Silicon Valley investors, and had signed major branding deals, including the naming rights to the Miami Heat's arena, FTX Arena. The speed of FTX's growth was itself a factor in the fraud's concealment. A company growing as rapidly as FTX attracted attention that was focused on the growth story rather than the governance details. Investors who were evaluating whether to put money into a company valued at multiple billions of dollars in a bull market for cryptocurrency were focused on the market opportunity, the growth metrics, and the founder's credibility. The internal accounting that would have revealed the flow of customer funds to Alameda was not the subject of the same scrutiny. This is not unusual. Fast-growing private companies are almost never subject to the audit standards that would have been required to detect the specific accounting irregularity at the center of the FTX fraud. But the absence of those standards was precisely the environment in which the fraud was sustainable. The connection between FTX and Alameda Research was known from the beginning. Bankman-Fried was the founder and controlling figure of both, and Alameda had been FTX's first institutional client. What was not known, outside the inner circle of people who had access to FTX's internal accounting, was the extent to which the boundary between the two entities had been effectively dissolved. The extent to which FTX customer funds were being moved to Alameda to fund Alameda's trading activities without the customer's knowledge or consent. The funds were being lent from the exchange to the trading firm at the direction and discretion of the same person who controlled both. The regulatory structure that governed FTX was a patchwork. The exchange operated through multiple corporate entities across different jurisdictions, the United States, the Bahamas, and others, with different regulatory regimes applying to different parts of the operation. FTX.US, the U.S.-facing entity, was registered and operated under U.S. regulations. FTX.com, the international exchange, was domiciled in the Bahamas, which had developed a regulatory framework for cryptocurrency exchanges. This jurisdictional complexity served, intentionally or not, to make comprehensive oversight difficult. Different regulators had authority over different pieces of the operation, and no single regulator had visibility into the whole. The FTT token, FTX's proprietary exchange token, played a central role in the financial structure that made the fraud possible. FTT was issued by FTX, and its value was in part derived from FTX's promise to buy back FTT with a fraction of trading fee revenue. Alameda Research held enormous quantities of FTT on its balance sheet, which counted as an asset whose value was, in a circular fashion, dependent on FTX's continued success. This meant that Alameda's reported financial health was partly a function of FTX's continued operation, and FTX's ability to support Alameda was partly a function of Alameda's reported health. The circular dependency was invisible from outside, but critically important to understanding why the structure worked in the bull market and collapsed so quickly when the first stress appeared. The public image of Samuel Bankman-Fried in 2021 and early 2022 was carefully constructed. He presented himself as something specific, the responsible face of cryptocurrency. He wore rumpled shorts and t-shirts to formal meetings. He drove a Toyota Corolla despite his reported net worth of billions of dollars. He spoke about effective altruism, the philosophical framework that argued one should maximize the good one did in the world, quantitatively, choosing actions based on their measurable impact, and pledged to give away the majority of his wealth to causes that could save or improve the most lives. He was a figure who seemed to have figured out how to do well and do good simultaneously, and who was willing to stand up and say so in a culture that was increasingly interested in that synthesis. The political and regulatory engagement was extensive. FTX funded a lobbying operation in Washington that was one of the largest in the cryptocurrency industry. Bankman-Fried made substantial donations to political campaigns and was one of the largest individual donors in the 2022 U.S. election cycle. He met with senior regulators. He testified before the Senate and the House of Representatives about cryptocurrency regulation, presenting himself as a reasonable voice for an industry that needed sensible rules. The message he delivered, that cryptocurrency needed regulation, that well-designed rules would benefit both consumers and the industry, was not the adversarial posture that many cryptocurrency advocates took toward regulators. It was a collaborative posture that gained him unusual access and credibility. The effective altruism framework that Bankman-Fried deployed publicly was not simply a personal philosophy. It was a presentation strategy that made him legible and sympathetic to a specific audience of media, policy, and intellectual communities that valued that kind of moral seriousness. He was not just a cryptocurrency billionaire. He was a cryptocurrency billionaire who had thought deeply about what he was obligated to do with his wealth. That framing made him more interesting, more trustworthy, and more difficult to dismiss than a straightforwardly commercial figure would have been. It was a brand identity that worked, in the sense that it opened doors and generated coverage and made people more likely to give him the benefit of the doubt when questions arose. FTX's venture capital investors included some of the most prestigious names in the technology investment world. Sequoia Capital had invested, Tiger Global had invested, Ontario Teachers Pension Plan had invested. The participation of these institutions in FTX's fundraising rounds was read correctly as a signal of legitimacy. These were sophisticated investors with due diligence processes, and their willingness to invest was, implicitly, a vote of confidence in FTX's governance and management. What the due diligence had not surfaced, what the investors had not seen, was the accounting that showed the flow of customer funds to Alameda. Sequoia Capital had gone so far as to publish a lengthy profile of Bankman-Fried that described him in terms that, in retrospect, illustrated how completely the public persona had been accepted by the investment community. The article described a person of extraordinary intelligence, genuine ethical commitment, and unusual practical wisdom. It was subsequently taken down after the collapse. The fact that a major VC firm had published this kind of profile was not an indictment of their judgment, as much as it was a measure of how thoroughly the performance had succeeded. The people who were supposed to be most skeptical of cryptocurrency founders had found him credible. The persuasiveness of the presentation was not an accident. The cryptocurrency market of 2021 had rewarded risk. FTX's customers, the traders and investors who used the exchange, had deposited their cryptocurrency in the expectation that FTX would hold those assets for them, available for trading or withdrawal. That is the basic function of a cryptocurrency exchange. It holds customer assets in custody, enabling trading, and returns those assets when customers request. FTX's terms of service and the reasonable expectations of any customer who understood the business they were doing were clear. The assets were the customers. They were not FTX's to lend, to invest, to use as collateral for trading positions. The fact that those assets had been moving to Alameda was not a gray area in terms that might be interpreted differently. It was a straightforward violation of the terms under which the assets had been entrusted to FTX. The collapse of FTX in November 2022 began with a CoinDesk article published on November 2, 2022. The article reported on a leaked document, Alameda Research's balance sheet, that showed that a substantial portion of Alameda's assets consisted of FTT, the exchange token issued by FTX. The concentration of FTT on Alameda's balance sheet raised an immediate question. If a significant portion of the trading firm's assets were in a token issued by and closely connected to the exchange, what would happen to the trading firm's balance sheet if the exchange's token lost value? The answer was apparent. Alameda's financial position was more fragile than it appeared from the outside, and it was fragile in a way that was directly connected to FTX's own stability. Changpeng Zhao, the CEO of Binance, FTX's largest competitor, announced on November 6, 2022, that Binance would liquidate its holdings of FTT. Binance held a substantial quantity of FTT as a result of an early investment in FTX that it had later exited. The announcement that Binance was selling its FT was not, in isolation, unusual. Large holders liquidate positions regularly. In the specific context of the CoinDesk reporting about Alameda's balance sheet, however, it triggered a cascade. The price of FTT began to fall. Customers of FTX, understanding that a falling FTT price would damage Alameda's balance sheet, and understanding that Alameda's balance sheet was somehow entangled with FTX, began withdrawing funds from the exchange. The mechanics of a bank run on a cryptocurrency exchange were in some ways similar to a run on a traditional bank, and in some ways different. The similarity was in the dynamic of confidence and withdrawal. Once customers doubted the exchange's solvency, the rational action was to withdraw funds, and the aggregation of that rational action by many customers simultaneously produced the insolvency the customers had feared. The fear was self-fulfilling. This is true of banks, of money market funds, and of cryptocurrency exchanges alike. Any institution that holds assets on behalf of customers and uses some fraction of those assets for other purposes is vulnerable to a simultaneous demand for return. The difference, in FTX's case, was that the vulnerability was not the ordinary leverage of a fractional reserve system, but the specific misappropriation of customer funds that had left the exchange with approximately $8 billion less than its customers collectively were owed. The run exposed a pre-existing hole. It did not create it. The CoinDesk article and the Binance announcement had been triggers for a run that revealed an insolvency that was already present. A shortfall that had been accumulating as Alameda's trading losses mounted, and as the funds that Alameda had borrowed from FTX's customer deposits failed to be returned. Within days, the withdrawal requests exceeded FTX's ability to fulfill them. On November 8, 2022, FTX suspended customer withdrawals. The message this sent to the market was unambiguous. FTX did not have the assets to return to its customers. The exchange that had held itself out as a regulated, transparent, and responsible actor in the cryptocurrency market could not fulfill the basic obligation of an exchange, returning customer funds when requested. The gap between FTX's public representation and its actual condition was fully exposed in that moment, even before the specific mechanism of the failure was publicly understood. In the days that followed, the extent of the shortfall became clearer. FTX's customer assets, the funds that customers had deposited and that the exchange was supposed to hold in custody, had been extensively transferred to Alameda. The hole in FTX's balance sheet was approximately $8 billion, funds that customers believed they held at the exchange, that were not there because they had been used by Alameda for trading and investment purposes and had not been returned. FTX filed for bankruptcy on November 11, 2022. The bankruptcy filing appointed John Ray, the restructuring expert who had famously overseen the Enron bankruptcy, as the new CEO. Ray's initial public statements about FTX's record-keeping were extraordinary in their directness. In his 40 years of legal and restructuring experience, he said he had never seen such a complete failure of corporate controls. The specific record-keeping failures that Ray documented were not just symptoms of disorganization. They were functional to the fraud. An exchange that maintained accurate, auditable records of every customer deposit and every transfer between FTX and Alameda would have generated evidence of the misappropriation with every transaction. The absence of those records, the use of QuickBooks software to manage multi-billion-dollar flows, the lack of a complete list of bank accounts, the commingling of funds across entities without documentation, was the organizational structure within which the fraud could operate, without leaving the kind of clear evidentiary trail that would have made it impossible to sustain. Whether the poor record-keeping was intentional or simply the result of chaotic growth, its effect was to provide cover for the misappropriation that was happening in parallel. Bankman-Fried had been in the Bahamas, where FTX's international operations were headquartered, during the week of the collapse. He had given interviews, posted on Twitter, and attempted to characterize the situation as a liquidity crisis rather than a solvency crisis, as a temporary mismatch between available funds and withdrawal requests, rather than the permanent disappearance of customer money. As the week progressed and the actual accounting became clearer, those characterizations became impossible to maintain. The public communications during the collapse were remarkable for their content and their timing. Bankman-Fried was posting long threads on Twitter explaining his perspective on the situation, describing the withdrawal freeze as a temporary measure, reaching out to competitors about a potential rescue. While the accounting that his own associates were assembling showed an $8 billion hole that could not be papered over. The gap between the public narrative and the private accounting was not accidental. It was the same gap that had characterized FTX's operation for years. The presentation of financial health to the outside world, while the internal reality was radically different. The collapse had made the private reality visible to everyone, and Bankman-Fried's public communications were, in retrospect, a continuation of the same practice that had produced the crisis. On December 12, 2022, Bankman-Fried was arrested at his residence in the Bahamas. The Bahamas had received a formal extradition request from the United States. Bankman-Fried was taken into custody, appeared before a Bahamian court, and was extradited to the United States within weeks. He arrived in New York and was released on bail, a bail package that included a $250 million personal recognizance bond, the largest in U.S. history, secured by his parents' home in Palo Alto. The months between his arrest and his trial were marked by the almost simultaneous guilty pleas of his closest associates. Caroline Ellison, the CEO of Alameda Research, pleaded guilty, Ryan Salem, an FTX co-CEO, pleaded guilty. Gary Wang, FTX's co-founder and chief technology officer, pleaded guilty. Nishad Singh, FTX's head of engineering, pleaded guilty. Each of them agreed to cooperate with the government. Each of them possessed knowledge of the internal operations of FTX and Alameda that would be directly relevant to establishing what Bankman-Fried had known and done. The cooperation of 4 senior executives meant that the prosecution's case would be substantially built from the testimony of people who had worked alongside Bankman-Fried at the highest levels of both companies. The charges against Bankman-Fried were filed in the Southern District of New York. They included 2 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, conspiracy to commit securities fraud, conspiracy to commit commodities fraud, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. The charges covered the fraud against FTX customers, fraud against FTX investors, and the broader financial misconduct surrounding the entities. The government's theory was comprehensive. Bankman-Fried had knowingly directed the transfer of customer funds to Alameda, had known that Alameda could not repay those funds if customers asked for them, and had fraudulently misrepresented FTX's condition to both customers and investors. The bail arrangement, the $250 million personal recognizance bond, secured by his parents' home, the largest in U.S. history at the time, reflected the extraordinary scale of the case and the government's concern about flight risk. Bankman-Fried was a person who had recently been based in the Bahamas, had extensive international connections, and had access to financial resources that made ordinary bail conditions potentially inadequate. The conditions placed on his release, electronic monitoring, travel restrictions, no access to cryptocurrency accounts, were designed to ensure that he remained accessible for trial. The bail period from his arrival in the United States in December 2022 through the trial's start in October 2023 was 10 months in which Bankman-Fried lived at his parents' home in Palo Alto under conditions that the court regularly reviewed and occasionally modified. The trial of Samuel Bankman-Fried began on October 3, 2023 in the Southern District of New York before Judge Lewis Kaplan. The prosecution opened with a simple narrative. Bankman-Fried had stolen $8 billion from FTX customers. He had taken money that customers had deposited for the purpose of trading cryptocurrency and had given it to Alameda Research to cover Alameda's losses and fund its operations. He had known this was happening. He had directed it or permitted it. He had told FTX customers that their funds were safe when he knew they were not. The deception was systematic, sustained, and had caused catastrophic harm to millions of people. The prosecution's opening framing was designed to place the jury in the position of FTX's customers, rather than in the position of financial industry specialists evaluating complex institutional arrangements. An FTX customer who deposited $1,000 to trade Bitcoin had a simple and reasonable expectation that their $1,000 would be held by the exchange and returned when they asked for it. They had not contracted to have their funds deployed in Alameda's leveraged trading strategies. They had not been told this was happening. They had not consented to it. The simplicity of that expectation and the directness of its violation was the prosecution's thematic foundation, and it was a foundation that required no specialized financial knowledge to understand. The defense presented a contrasting narrative. Bankman-Fried had not committed fraud. He had made business decisions, some of them bad decisions, decisions he now recognized were mistakes, but bad business decisions made in good faith were not crimes. The movement of funds from FTX to Alameda had occurred within a legal framework that permitted FTX to extend credit to related parties under certain conditions. The collapse of FTX was a result of an unforeseeable external event. The bank run triggered by Binance's announcement and the CoinDesk reporting rather than the consequence of underlying fraud. The defense argued for a distinction between recklessness and criminality. Caroline Ellison was the prosecution's most important witness. As the CEO of Alameda and Bankman-Fried's former romantic partner, she had direct knowledge of the financial arrangements between FTX and Alameda. She testified that Bankman-Fried had directed her to maintain a secret line of credit from FTX to Alameda, a credit line that allowed Alameda to borrow customer funds without FTX customers' knowledge. She testified that the credit line had grown over time as Alameda's trading losses mounted, that Bankman-Fried was aware of the growing hole, and that the spreadsheets she had prepared at his direction included a specifically altered version designed to hide Alameda's true financial position from lenders and investors. Her testimony was detailed, specific, and covered by corroborating documents. The defense's cross-examination of Ellison attempted to reframe her testimony by emphasizing her role as the person who had actually executed the transactions at Alameda, who had, as CEO, made the specific decisions about borrowing, about the spreadsheets, about the credit line's day-to-day management. The defense suggested that Bankman-Fried had been insufficiently attentive to Alameda's operations, that Ellison had acted with more autonomy than she was acknowledging, and that her cooperation agreement, including the specific benefit of a sentencing recommendation reflecting her cooperation, created an incentive to characterize her own role as less central and Bankman-Fried's role as more directive than the facts supported. Ellison acknowledged on cross-examination that she had known what she was doing, that she had made decisions, and that she bore responsibility. What she maintained, and what the prosecution's corroborating evidence supported, was that the structure of the arrangement, the credit line, the software exemption, the specific instructions about what to present to lenders, had originated with Bankman-Fried and had operated under his ongoing direction and awareness. The cross-examination had not shaken the substance of her account. Gary Wang, FTX's co-founder, testified that he had programmed a special exemption into FTX's software at Bankman-Fried's direction, an exemption that allowed Alameda to carry a negative balance on FTX in an amount that eventually reached $65 billion. This was not a small technical accommodation. It was a fundamental alteration of the exchange's accounting and risk systems, designed to allow Alameda to borrow from FTX's customer deposits without any automatic limit. The existence of the exemption, written into the software of the exchange, was the mechanism through which the fraud had operated. Wang had written the code. Bankman-Fried had directed him to write it. The significance of the $65 billion negative balance capability was not simply in its scale. It was in what its existence revealed about intent. A conventional lending arrangement, even a generous one between related parties, would be bounded. It would have limits based on the borrower's collateral, the lender's risk tolerance, and the requirement that the funds loaned were the lender's to lend. The software exemption had no such limit. It was an unlimited authorization written into the exchange's code that allowed Alameda to draw from FTX's customer deposits without any mechanism to stop the borrowing, escalate a review, or alert anyone outside the small group who knew about the exemption. The only reason the borrowing ever stopped was because FTX collapsed. In a world where FTX's business had continued to grow, there was no internal mechanism that would have eventually triggered scrutiny of whether Alameda had borrowed more than it could repay. Wang's testimony established that the exemption was not an accident of system design or an oversight that went undetected. It was a deliberate feature, created in response to a specific request, designed to enable a specific capability, and the person who had made the request was Bankman-Fried. Nishad Singh, FTX's head of engineering, provided testimony about the internal atmosphere at FTX during the period when the fraud was operating. He described an organization in which the people who knew about the Alameda arrangements understood their seriousness but felt unable to effectively object, where the authority structure centered on Bankman-Fried made raising concerns about fundamental financial practices feel futile. Singh's own role in the fraud was significant enough that he faced serious criminal exposure, and his decision to cooperate reflected both the government's ability to offer meaningful consideration for cooperation and his own assessment that continuing to protect an organization whose conduct he had witnessed firsthand was not sustainable. His testimony filled in details about the operational reality of FTX that Wong and Ellison had established from different vantage points. On October 12, 2023, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on all 7 counts. The deliberation had taken 4 hours and 40 minutes. The speed of the verdict, faster than many observers had expected for a trial of such complexity, reflected the clarity with which the jury had assessed the evidence. The 4 cooperating witnesses had provided consistent, detailed, and corroborated testimony. The documentary evidence, spreadsheets, communications, software code, had supported and extended that testimony. The defense argument that Bankman-Fried had acted in good faith had not persuaded the jury that the movement of $8 billion in customer funds to a related trading firm was anything other than fraud. After the verdict, Bankman-Fried returned to custody to await sentencing. The presentence report, a comprehensive investigation of the defendant's background, the nature of the offense, and the relevant sentencing factors, was prepared by the probation office and provided to Judge Kaplan. The government and the defense each submitted extensive sentencing memoranda, arguing for the sentence they believed was appropriate. The government's sentencing memo recommended 40 to 50 years in prison. The defense's memo argued for a sentence significantly below the advisory guidelines, pointing to Bankman-Fried's personal history, his stated intentions, and the absence of a prior criminal record. The government's argument for a lengthy sentence focused on several factors. The scale of the harm, $8 billion stolen from customers across 160 countries, was extraordinary. The duration of the fraud, years of ongoing deception, not a single moment of bad judgment, demonstrated calculated and sustained criminality. The position of trust that Bankman-Fried had occupied, as the CEO of an exchange that held customer assets in fiduciary capacity, made the betrayal particularly serious. And the specific nature of the deception, the public presentation as a responsible actor while privately directing fraud, was an aggravating circumstance that the sentence should reflect. The defense's argument for leniency emphasized Bankman-Fried's life before FTX, his academic achievements, his history of commitment to charitable causes, the circumstances of a young person who had grown up in an environment of high intellectual achievement and had been shaped by a philosophical framework that prized outcomes over process. The defense argued that the appropriate sentence was a period that served the purposes of punishment and deterrence without being destructive in a way that served no additional purpose. Whatever the length of time, the defense argued, Bankman-Fried would not be a danger after release, and a very long sentence was therefore disproportionate to the legitimate goals of sentencing. Bankman-Fried's decision to testify in his own defense was unusual for a defendant in a financial fraud case. Defendants in federal criminal trials have an absolute right not to testify, and the conventional defense wisdom in complex fraud cases is that testifying exposes a defendant to cross-examination on details they cannot fully control, while providing little that the defense cannot deliver through counsel's argument. Bankman-Fried chose to testify. His testimony, which Judge Kaplan later described as unpersuasive and in some respects dishonest, provided the prosecution with a direct cross-examination opportunity that appeared to damage rather than help his case. The decision to take the stand was itself a window into something about how he had operated, a confidence in his own ability to perform his way through scrutiny that had served him well in the years of FTX's rise, and that failed him in the specific context of a federal courtroom. On March 28, 2024, Judge Lewis Kaplan sentenced Samuel Bankman-Fried to 25 years in federal prison. The sentence was less than the 40 to 50 years the government had requested, but substantially more than the 6.5 years the defense had argued for. Judge Kaplan addressed the factors that drove his decision in an extensive statement from the bench. He rejected the defense's characterization of Bankman-Fried as someone who had made mistakes in good faith. He found that Bankman-Fried had committed deliberate fraud, that he had known what he was doing, and that the scale and duration of the crime warranted significant punishment. He also noted, specifically, that he found Bankman-Fried's testimony at trial, he had chosen to take the stand in his own defense, to have been unpersuasive and in some respects dishonest. Judge Kaplan's bench statement was notable for its specificity. He addressed the defense arguments directly. On the question of whether the fraud had caused real harm, the defense had partially argued that customers might ultimately recover a meaningful fraction of their losses through the bankruptcy. Kaplan was direct. The harm was the theft, not merely its downstream consequences. An $8 billion misappropriation caused harm regardless of what the bankruptcy ultimately returned, because customers had been deprived of the use and control of their funds from the moment they were taken, and because many had suffered concrete damage as a result of the collapse, selling at depressed prices, missing subsequent market recoveries, making financial decisions based on assets they believed they held but did not. On the question of Bankman-Fried's personal characteristics, the intelligence, the charitable commitments, the serious engagement with philosophical questions about obligation, Kaplan acknowledged these facts without treating them as mitigating in the context of deliberate, sustained fraud. Many people of intelligence and stated good intentions had committed crimes. The capabilities that made someone persuasive, effective at building trust, and skilled at maintaining a public persona, these were the tools through which the fraud had operated. They did not reduce the sentence. In some respects, they reinforced it, because those same capabilities had enabled the fraud's duration and scale. The 25-year sentence placed Bankman-Fried among the most severely sentenced financial fraudsters in U.S. history. Bernie Madoff had received 150 years for a fraud that had run for decades and caused losses that were, in total, larger than the FTX losses. Raj Rajaratnam, convicted of insider trading in 2011, had received 11 years. Alan Stanford, convicted in connection with an $8 billion fraud, had received 110 years. The FTX fraud was not the largest financial fraud in history, but its speed, the concentration of harm in a short period, and its breadth, affecting customers in 160 countries, supported a severe outcome. The sentence was immediately appealed by the defense. The appeal argued, among other things, that the trial had not been conducted fairly, that the judge had made evidentiary rulings that prejudiced the defense, and that the sentence was disproportionate in ways that warranted reconsideration. The appeal would be decided by the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in the months and years following the sentencing. The outcome of the appeal was not determined within the period covered by this account. The 25 years would be served in the federal prison system, with standard reductions for good conduct, potentially reducing the actual time served by a meaningful fraction. Bankman-Fried was designated to serve his sentence at a federal facility, the specific assignment reflecting the Bureau of Prisons' assessment of the appropriate security level for a non-violent financial criminal. The practical experience of a person who had been, 2 years earlier, one of the most powerful figures in the cryptocurrency industry, meeting with heads of state, appearing on magazine covers, commanding a reported net worth of billions, arriving at a federal facility to begin a multi-decade sentence was a specific kind of accounting that the financial figures in the case could not fully capture. The cooperating witnesses, Ellison, Wang, Singh, and Salame, awaited their own sentencing proceedings, which were scheduled for later in 2024. The government had committed to making sentencing recommendations that reflected their extensive cooperation. Whatever their ultimate sentences, the expectation was that each would receive a significant reduction from the guidelines range in recognition of the testimony they had provided and the degree to which their cooperation had been essential to building the case against Bankman-Fried. The disparity between their expected sentences and Bankman-Fried's 25 years was a reflection of the system's incentive structure for cooperation, and of the fundamental difference in culpability between the person who directed the fraud and the people who carried out his directions. The investigation that produced the FTX prosecution was remarkable for its speed and comprehensiveness. FTX filed for bankruptcy on November 11, 2022. Bankman-Fried was arrested on December 12, 2022, 31 days after the bankruptcy. The trial began less than a year after the arrest, on October 3, 2023, a timeline that was extraordinarily fast for a case of this complexity in the U.S. federal court system. Cases involving large-scale financial fraud typically took multiple years to develop, as investigators gathered and analyzed financial records, identified and interviewed witnesses, and built the evidentiary record that a prosecution required. The FTX prosecution moved at a pace that reflected both the clarity of the underlying facts and the urgency that the government attached to the case. The speed was enabled in part by the blockchain record and in part by the cooperation of the senior executives. The flow of funds from FTX to Alameda was documented in internal records that the bankruptcy team, led by John Ray, immediately began to recover and share with investigators. The cooperation of Ellison, Wang, Singh, and Salame provided direct testimony from people who had participated in the scheme and had detailed knowledge of Bankman-Fried's role. With 4 senior executives cooperating from early in the investigation, the government was able to build its evidentiary case with unusual completeness and speed. The Southern District of New York brought the case with the specific legal strategy of charging multiple counts across multiple theories of fraud. The wire fraud counts covered the deception of FTX customers. The conspiracy charges covered the broader scheme. The inclusion of money laundering charges reflected the government's ability to trace the flow of misappropriated funds through multiple accounts and entities. Each count represented a different legal theory applied to the same underlying conduct, and the combination of 7 counts meant that even if the defense succeeded in raising doubt on some theories, the prosecution had multiple independent paths to conviction. The speed with which the case moved from bankruptcy to arrest to trial to sentencing, approximately 16 months for the entire arc, was a reflection of the exceptional priority the SDNY placed on the prosecution. The resources dedicated to building the case were substantial. Teams of prosecutors, FBI agents, forensic accountants, and blockchain analysts working in parallel. The cooperation of 4 senior executives who had worked at the highest levels of FTX and Alameda provided the prosecution with an unusual depth of witness testimony. Not just one insider, but 4, each corroborating the others across different aspects of the same scheme. The combination of the blockchain record, the internal documents recovered through the bankruptcy, and the extensive cooperating witness testimony made the evidentiary foundation unusually strong. The international dimensions of the investigation required cooperation from multiple jurisdictions. FTX had operated across dozens of countries. Bankman-Fried had been in the Bahamas when the collapse occurred, and the extradition from the Bahamas, accomplished within weeks of his arrest, reflected the cooperation of the Bahamian government and the speed of the formal extradition process. The SDNY's jurisdiction over the case was established through the wire fraud charges, which applied to fraudulent communications that had been transmitted in interstate commerce, regardless of where the primary actors were physically located. The Securities and Exchange Commission and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission also filed civil charges against Bankman-Fried and FTX entities in parallel with the criminal prosecution. These civil proceedings addressed the investor fraud and commodity manipulation aspects of the case and sought disgorgement of ill-gotten gains and civil penalties. The civil proceedings moved on a separate track from the criminal case, but were built on the same underlying facts, and their resolution was ultimately constrained by the criminal proceedings and the bankruptcy process's claims on whatever assets could be recovered. The role of blockchain evidence in the prosecution illustrated how the transparency properties of public ledgers, properties that the cryptocurrency industry had cited as advantages of the technology, could function as forensic tools in criminal investigations. The movement of funds from FTX to Alameda, traced on-chain, provided corroboration for the cooperating witnesses' testimony that did not depend on those witnesses' credibility alone. The blockchain records existed independently of anyone's account of events. Forensic blockchain analysts could trace specific transactions from FTX customer accounts through intermediate wallets to Alameda research addresses and document the history with a precision that traditional financial fraud cases rarely achieved. The irony was direct. The technology's transparency, which FTX had cited in its marketing as a feature that made the exchange trustworthy, had produced the very evidentiary record the prosecution used to prove that trust had been violated. This did not mean that blockchain evidence was simple to analyze. The expert testimony required to explain on-chain tracing to a jury was specialized and technical, but the evidence existed with a persistence and completeness that paper records could not match, and its existence materially strengthened the prosecution's evidentiary foundation. The sentencing of Samuel Bankman-Fried in March 2024 marked the legal conclusion of the most significant financial fraud prosecution in the cryptocurrency industry's history. The FTX case had implications for the industry that extended well beyond the specific parties involved. It demonstrated, with a clarity and definitiveness that no prior case had achieved, that the United States legal system was capable of prosecuting cryptocurrency fraud at the largest scale, that the technical complexity of the underlying technology did not provide legal immunity, that the involvement of sophisticated institutional investors did not indicate legitimacy, and that the public presentation of a cryptocurrency executive as a responsible and constructive industry actor was not a reliable indicator of their conduct in private. The specific lesson for institutional investors was about the limits of the due diligence they had performed. Sequoia Capital, Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan, and other sophisticated institutions had invested hundreds of millions of dollars in FTX equity. Their due diligence processes had not identified the flow of customer funds to Alameda. The failure was not the result of inadequate sophistication. It was the result of the fundamental limitation of due diligence when the key misrepresentation concerns the integrity of the person controlling access to information. You cannot conduct due diligence on a lie if the person controlling the information is the one telling it. Every financial relationship carries that residual trust requirement at its core. FTX demonstrated, at scale, What happens when it is violated? The case also contributed to the regulatory momentum that was reshaping the cryptocurrency industry throughout 2023 and into 2024. FTX had been one of the most politically connected cryptocurrency companies, with extensive lobbying operations and relationships with senior government officials. The collapse of FTX did not make regulators sympathetic to the industry's arguments for light-touch oversight. It reinforced the position of those who argued that cryptocurrency exchanges needed to be subject to the same customer protection rules: segregation of customer assets, mandatory audits, capital requirements that govern traditional financial exchanges. The FTX case was, in the regulatory debates of 2023, the most powerful argument that the cryptocurrency industry's existing self-regulatory frameworks were inadequate. The specific regulatory proposals that gained traction after the FTX collapse focused on what the case had most directly exposed: the segregation of customer assets, the requirement that an exchange hold customer funds separately from the exchange's own funds and from any affiliated trading operation, was central to the debate. The FTX fraud had been made possible by the absence of mandatory segregation requirements equivalent to those that governed traditional securities brokers and futures commission merchants. Customer funds at FTX had been legally intermingled with FTX's operational funds, and from there moved to Alameda, without a mandatory audit or regulatory inspection that would have detected the movement in time. Proof of reserves requirements, the obligation for exchanges to periodically demonstrate, through cryptographic attestation or third-party audit, that they held customer assets at or above the level claimed, also gained support as a standard that exchanges could be required to meet. The concept was technically achievable for cryptocurrency exchanges in a way it was not for traditional banks, and the FTX case gave it political urgency. Whether the legislative and regulatory processes would translate that urgency into binding requirements before the memory of the case faded was a question that the period covered by this account had not yet fully resolved. The victims of the FTX collapse, the customers whose funds were stolen, were addressed in the bankruptcy proceedings that ran parallel to the criminal case. The bankruptcy trustee, John Ray, worked to recover assets and develop a plan to repay customers. The cryptocurrency market's recovery through 2023, Bitcoin's price rising substantially from the lows of late 2022, increased the dollar value of assets that could be returned, and the estimates of customer recovery improved significantly through the bankruptcy process. The eventual recovery for FTX customers, at the prices prevailing in the period when distributions would occur, was expected to be substantially above zero, a significantly better outcome than many had feared in the first weeks after the collapse. The people who had invested in FTX's equity, the venture capital firms and institutional investors who had valued the company at $32 billion, did not fare as well. Equity holders receive distributions only after creditors are made whole in a bankruptcy, and the hole in FTX's balance sheet was large enough that equity distributions were unlikely. Sequoia Capital had written down its FTX investment to zero within days of the collapse. The institutional investors who had relied on their due diligence processes to validate FTX's legitimacy lost everything they had invested. This outcome had its own lesson about the limits of due diligence when the fundamental misrepresentation concerns the nature of the relationship between two entities controlled by the same person. The customer recovery story that emerged from the FTX bankruptcy was, in its ultimate shape, more constructive than many had initially feared. John Ray and the bankruptcy estate's advisors pursued asset recovery aggressively, identifying funds held in jurisdictions around the world, clawing back transfers made in the period before the bankruptcy, and in some cases pursuing litigation against parties who had received funds from FTX under circumstances that made those transfers challengeable under bankruptcy law. The cryptocurrency market's recovery, Bitcoin returning to and substantially exceeding its pre-collapse levels through 2023 and into 2024, increased the dollar value of cryptocurrency assets the estate had recovered. The estimates for customer recovery in the weeks after the bankruptcy filing had centered on 20 to 30 cents on the dollar as a reasonable expectation. As both asset recovery and market recovery progressed, those estimates improved considerably. The final distribution levels were not determined within the period covered by this account, but the trajectory was toward a meaningfully higher recovery rate than the initial figures had suggested. This did not undo the harm. Customers had lost access to their funds for years, had made decisions based on assets they did not have, and many had suffered real damage that a delayed partial recovery could not repair. But it was a different outcome than a total loss, and it distinguished FTX from frauds where the assets had been genuinely consumed, rather than misappropriated into an entity that retained recoverable value. The FTX prosecution also established in the most consequential way possible that the cryptocurrency industry's self-regulatory claims, its assertions that it could govern itself responsibly without comprehensive external oversight, had produced at its most visible institutional level an $8 billion fraud. This finding became central to every regulatory debate that followed. Legislators who had been skeptical of the industry's calls for light-touch regulation found in FTX the clearest possible evidence that the skepticism was warranted. The legislative and regulatory processes that produced tighter rules for cryptocurrency exchanges in the years after the collapse were shaped, in their specifics and in their urgency, by the particular failure that Bankman-Fried's sentencing had formally concluded. Close your eyes one more time. On March 28, 2024, in a federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan, Judge Lewis Kaplan spoke for an extended period before announcing the sentence. He addressed Bankman-Fried directly. He spoke about the scale of what had been done: $8 billion, 160 countries, customers who had trusted the exchange with everything from small cryptocurrency holdings to life savings. He spoke about the duration and the deliberateness of it. Not a single bad decision made in a moment of pressure, but a sustained arrangement that had required ongoing choices, ongoing deception, ongoing maintenance of a public image that contradicted the private reality. 25 years. That was the number that Judge Kaplan arrived at, the number that represents the court's accounting of what had been done and what was owed. Samuel Bankman-Fried was 32 years old when he was sentenced. He would be 57 when he became eligible for release, assuming standard reductions for good conduct. The years between those points represent the period in which the 25-year question, whether the legal system had a commensurate response to a fraud of this scale, was answered. The four cooperating executives, Ellison, Wang, Singh, Salam, faced their own sentencing hearings in the months ahead. They had made the prosecution possible. Their cooperation had built the evidentiary foundation on which the 7-count conviction rested. Whatever sentences they ultimately received, the distance between their outcomes and Bankman-Fried's 25 years was a measure of something the legal system tried to maintain: that cooperation was valuable, and that the person who directed others to commit fraud bore a greater share of the accountability than those who, however seriously, had followed his direction. The FTX collapse did not kill cryptocurrency. It damaged it severely in a specific period, and the long recovery of the market through 2023 and early 2024 was partly a demonstration that the asset class had survived the largest fraud in its history. The questions the case raised about exchange regulation, customer protection, and the reliability of institutional-looking cryptocurrency companies were not resolved by Bankman-Fried's conviction. They had been raised with more clarity and urgency than before. The answers would come in the regulatory developments and legal proceedings that continued after the sentencing concluded. What the FTX case did resolve, permanently in the sense that court records do not reverse, was the question of individual accountability. The argument that cryptocurrency's decentralized and technically complex character placed it beyond the reach of traditional fraud law had been tested in the most consequential possible way and had failed. Samuel Bankman-Fried had been the most sophisticated, the most legally engaged, the most deliberately compliance-oriented cryptocurrency executive of his generation. He had hired the lawyers, built the lobbying operation, testified before Congress, and constructed the public image with precision. None of it had provided legal protection once the fraud was fully visible. The prosecution's success was, in one sense, a simple proposition. Fraud is fraud regardless of the asset class, and the legal system designed to protect people from financial deception applies to cryptocurrency as it applies to everything else. The complexity of the technology had been real. The sophistication of the presentation had been real. The legal result had been straightforward, and now that record settles into the quiet. $8 billion, 7 counts, 25 years. The accounting is made. The numbers are what they are. Let them drift now into the dark behind your eyes, and let the night carry you somewhere that numbers cannot reach.